I think one of the most public cases most recently is the P. Diddy case.
Yes.
And, even thinking about the way that the defense shaped their defense was so much about he wasn't engaging in trafficking, he was just engaging in domestic violence. And so the way that they talked about that, the way that they structured their messaging around it, the minimization around domestic violence, and again, to your comment about reading the comments, the way that people really then attack the character of victim survivors when they are able to leave and what the circumstances around that. I think there's so much lack of understanding around coercion and control. And it was such a visualization and confirmation of how, as a society, we really rank violence, gender-based violence. So welcome to the Domestic Abuse Projects podcast. My name is Amirthini Keefe. I'm the executive director, and I'm so glad that you're joining us today. I am excited to have Melissa Scaia, one of our colleagues at DAP, and an expert in the community here to talk with us about domestic violence, about intimate partner violence, about community violence, and the ways that we're talking and thinking about that concept right now. We're really excited to have you as a thought leader, as a change maker, to come here and share your stories and the challenges and the learnings that you have garnered across the way. So do you want to introduce yourself a little bit and share a little bit about your experience?
Sure. So I'll just say a little bit. Melissa Scaia. I have a couple roles. One of those is I work part-time for DAP, and it's just been over a year, and it's been a gift to me, really, just to work with such a great organization. All the staff have been amazing, and I don't say that, everywhere, and I just love working at DAP. At DAP, I work part-time as a systems advocate coordinator, and so I work to help create systemic change related to DAP's service area. And then I'm what I might call a fill-in facilitator for the men's intervention program or the women who use force group. Outside of DAP, I do a lot of consulting, training, and I'm on there's a roster of international experts on domestic violence for UN Women. So I do some work with UN Women and travel the globe for that. And then I work with my colleague, Laura Williams, as part of the Global Alliance for Women's Safety and Equality on a number of projects globally. So I get the benefit of being here locally and internationally as well. And then for many years, I ran a domestic violence program, Northeast Minnesota, and worked in Duluth at what many people know as the Duluth model.
Yeah. Well, we're so lucky to have you at DAP and to have you here today. We wanted to start by talking about different types of domestic violence. So can you share what the types are, how you conceptualize them?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the sort of benefits and curse of people knowing more about domestic violence, right? Is that people know more about it. We still need to work on that. The problem is so many things are getting lumped into, that's a domestic, or that's just domestic violence. And what we know is not all domestic violence is the same. And so what we've tried to do is to put them into three broader categories, okay? So the first one is what we would call coercive controlling violence and abuse. When I started many, many years ago, the term we used was battering. We don't generally use that term often anymore because it's too associated with physical, right? So that's why we use coercive controlling violence and abuse. The second category is resistive violence. So a way, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, but a quick way to say it is when adult survivors or children fight back. So they're living under, right? So I'm putting my right hand up here and this one here because it's a relationship like this where coercive controlling is happening here, and anyone who lives under, right, coercive control is going to resist, whether it's in a family or a country, right? It can happen on a large scale or small scale.
Right.
But then we do have a small number of cases in most communities around the world we call violence unrelated to coercive control. So often I'll say it's off the triangle, right? So in this, if you could see my hands kind of in a triangle here, or it doesn't have those elements, but we do get cases where it's my experience, it ranges on a high end 10%. And when I'm talking about cases that an organization will see or the criminal justice will see, 10% would actually be on the higher end of those often.
Okay.
So it's not the vast majority for sure.
And you talked about coercive control and how that is different from other forms of abuse, and it's a way to really get away from just thinking about physical. Can you share more about how you would define that and what that looks like?
Yeah. So one of the things that happened in the 1980s was that in Duluth, they were doing what they call education groups for survivors. And they were talking with survivors about what many people know as the cycle of violence, which is the 3 phase, right? Like the tension building phase, the violence explosion phase, and the honeymoon. And survivors kept saying, I don't know that honeymoon. I don't know what you're talking about. And you're giving me the sense, that I should be having, but I don't have it. And so what they decided to do is say, okay, we're going to stop pushing this theory on you, right? And we're just going to listen to survivors from across Duluth, and we're just going to write down all the things that your partner does to you, right, outside of physical or sexual violence. So they wrote all those things down. And so that's how the power and control wheel came to be born. And so for those who, some people still talk about the cycle of violence, but there's been a fair amount of research now that says we shouldn't use that in our analysis for numerous reasons. But to say that's how we end up using control, power and control, or coercive control. And it was Evan Stark who really sort of termed the phrase coercive control, which is trying to get your partner to do something they don't want to do,
right,
and using a tactic to get them to do it.
Right, right. Which we see in all different kinds of ways that happen, and in different settings too. And you can see that happening in intimate partner relationships. You can see that happening in workplace relationships. Yes. You can see that happening, in community in different ways. Is there a way that you would differentiate between what is intimate partner violence and what is not?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, of course, what intimate partner violence brings us is the proximity, right, and what we know about people, right? The way the tactics play out there, right? So, for example, with children, right? So if you have children, often those children will get used, right, as a tactic to control. So, for example, it's very, very common for abusers, if there's multiple children, to align themselves, or what some people say, have a favorite child, right? Because what they're often doing with that child is to use them against the other parent, literally turn them against the other parent. I remember this one time, Amirthini, doing a focus group with survivors who were separated from their partners. And I said, can you give me an example of one of the worst things that your partner has done outside of physical or sexual violence? And I remember there just kind of being these instant tears. And I said, what's happening? Most of them told stories about how their abusive partner turned one or more of the children against them. Right. That their child was saying the same things to them, or their child lost all respect for them. So I remember this one woman saying, like, it was like a snap of a finger. All of a sudden their child was, so that's a different level of pain. Yes. I'm not saying, it's better or worse. I don't want to give judgment to that, but it's not the same as when it's not when it's outside of an intimate partner relationship.
Right. And we see that a lot in civil cases around child custody.
Yes.
And family separation. Can you share a little bit more about resistive violence? So, folks often, like something that we hear really commonly in our groups is it's mutual abuse. The person that's in our group for using violence is talking about tactics or behaviors that they might be seeing in their partner, or that they say that their partner is engaging with them that results in their use of violence. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about how, as a community member or as a provider, you'd be able to really suss out what that looks like?
This is a topic I feel very passionate about and spend a lot of time talking about, because in part, when we get it wrong as interveners, right? Or when we call it mutual abuse, new term I've heard is bi-directional abuse, right? Yep. So I'm putting my hands sort of, like side by side, as opposed to like this, right? Where you have a dominating, right? And children and survivors who are living under it. When we get that wrong, where we name the wrong person on top, or we call it mutual and it's really this, the impacts are big on survivors. And so it's really important for us to kind of, as a community, to use the same terminology, it really matters.
Right.
I know a lot of people sometimes will use reactive abuse. We tend not to use that because it can be perceived as like they just reacted to something in the moment, when really they're living under, right, pattern tactics by the abuser that are being used against them. So resistive violence and abuse can be used by survivors, adult survivors, but also children. So it's important to sort of think about, if you have a family with multiple people, it's not just the adult survivor, but also children. And we have to name it right for them too, because that's really, really important. So one way to distinguish the difference is to say, you have to look at the intent of the violence and its effect.
Yep.
And this is one topic I have done some research on myself here in Minnesota. And my colleagues have, Shamita Das Gupta and Lisa Lawrence, and we all keep hearing the same things, whether it's Minnesota or across the country or globally. The difference in resistive violence and abuse versus coercive controlling violence and abuse, where a lot of people get hung up, is because a survivor will say, well, I just wanted him to whatever, right? Like, stop calling me that name.
Right.
And then somebody else say, well, isn't that control, Melissa? Say, there's a difference in terms of trying to get for a short-term situation versus having the thinking, right, that no matter what this person does, I'm entitled, right, to tell them what to do, how to act, how to think, and I'm going to do that. That's not the same as trying to get short-term command over a situation.
Or safety, right?
Yeah,
you want to prevent being harmed further.
Yeah, lots of survivors are doing things to resist that are legal and illegal, right? Because they're trying to stay safe for themselves and their children.
Could you share a couple examples of what resistive violence might look like in children?
Yeah, so a recent example, I would say, when I was doing some interviewing and talking, would be that the child, it was a young boy, and he just said, I could not listen to my mom's boyfriend talk about my mom like that one more time. And I had it. And so he just went after him. And it was as part of an incident also. But now this child was 17, okay? And what was fascinating about the response, and part of what we've learned, is that when often interveners come in, whether it's a social worker or police, that the abusers are using the language of the culture. And what I mean by that is, kids these days, they're so disrespectful. Kids these days don't listen, right? And I have seen interveners just pick that up, right? And then the focus becomes the problem here, and the cause of the violence is because the child made a choice, and we just need to teach this child to have better choices and better options. Right. And I see it over and over in Amirthini, where that's where the focus is, right? They send the child, sometimes in out-of-home placement or in a group home or something. All the focus is on make better choices, and not enough to see, is this child's violence connected to dominating, coercive, controlling? Because if you don't solve that problem, who wouldn't? Most people living under abuse are going to resist, right? Now, some of that, is going to be physical, but there's a whole range of tactics that, survivors and children use when they're living under that.
So I'm going to ask the question because I know other people will.
Yeah.
How would you differentiate what you just shared about children and really trying to teach them how to make different choices?
Yep.
How would you differentiate your perspective around that as compared to working with adults who have used violence in their relationship?
Yeah.
Because I could see a lot of folks conflating the two together.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's important, of course, is that a child's in a very different social position about being able to make different choices. Right. Their access, in terms of resources, of being able to leave, having access, to any money to leave. When their phone is constantly being taken away as a form of punishment, they don't have enough money to get their own. So social position in the world and in the culture matters.
Yes.
And different social positions create different vulnerabilities and different risks, right? And age isn't just one of them, right? This is what we're talking about right now, right? In the social position of a child versus an adult, but that really makes a big difference. And then also just say about whether people believe them, right? Yes. It really makes a big difference. And so I'll just say that.
Yeah, I think how we define control and who actually truly has control really is context dependent.
Yes.
Right. In thinking about cycles of violence, how do you think cycles of violence really get reinforced from generation to generation or across generations?
Yeah. And just to be clear, we're not talking about the cycle of violence.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Just to clarify.
Yes.
Yeah. After now I just said don't use that anymore. But generational. Yes. Yeah, I mean, one of the things I recently heard you say, Amirthini, is just, I think, maybe just, why don't you say a little bit about when we were just talking recently about the learned versus unlearned? Because I think that's important.
So at the Domestic Abuse Project, we, something that we share a lot and say a lot to the folks that we work with is that violence is learned, and if it's learned, it can be unlearned. And so much of the conversations that we're having with victim survivors and with kids and with folks that use violence is, where are we picking up all of this information? What are the things that we're observing? What are the things that we learned through the way that our families navigated conflict? What is society telling us is okay and not okay? And how has that shaped our core beliefs about ourselves, about how we engage with other people, and about how we engage in relationship and in relationship conflict and communication. And from there, what is it that feels like we can identify through these conversations with each other about what is healthy and what's unhealthy, what we want to let go of, what we want to hang on to and keep building off of to have and develop healthy ways of communicating. And so much of that is from what we've absorbed.
Yeah, absolutely. And the way I sort of think about it with survivors and is to think about, what is love? What is a relationship? What is an equal and caring relationship? And I'll just give you an example is I did a focus group with survivors, and we ended up on the topic of their partner being jealous, about them. And this one woman said during the focus group, she said, well, I don't like it if my partner isn't jealous. I was like, oh, really? Tell me about that, right? Because I'm curious about it. She said, I feel like if they're not jealous, they don't love me. I said, that's fascinating. And I will tell you, nearly, not all, but nearly every other woman was thinking the same way. They said it. They had other examples of it, right? So if when children sort of grow up, or generations aren't just in families, they're in culture, right? We get messages all the time, right? About what is love, what is caring, what is a relationship, what's not. I remember not too long ago, I was talking with a man who had used violence against his partner, and he said this thing, well, I'm never going to be in a relationship. I'm not in a relationship. I said, oh, so you're not in a relationship right now? And he said, nope, I've given them up. And I know enough right now about the culture, about what relationship means, and about how I define it and how he defines it. So I said, okay, let me ask you this. Now, I'm not going to make you do this, but if I asked you, hand over your cell phone with your no passwords on it, and if I were to look through your phone, are you having any relations with anyone? Because, well, I didn't say that. I said, exactly. Right? So, generationally, that's changed, right? Culturally, this changes. But, for me, I'm Gen X, I might just say, right? In Gen X, if you were in a relationship, you were in a relationship, and you, I wore their jacket or their sweater, and that was, I know if people do that anymore, probably not, but showing my age. But, there are all these things, right, about what it means, right? Or my daughter is saying situationship, right? There's all these sort of ways in which it gets formed, not just in the broader culture, but in family, and about how we see how things live. So those things get passed on, right, from generation. And one survivor said it recently in a way I was really helpful. She just said, here's the thing. You have to understand there's what's love, but what love gets fused with, and I really liked how she described that, right? She said that comes, of course, from my family. Yes. But it also comes with a lot of other things. And so I bet if she and I sort of were able to talk that out a little bit about how what love gets fused for, right, for me and for her are probably different, right? Our ages are different generation, different family background. And so I would say it that way.
So you started by, your last statement by talking about survivors. And I know that so much of the way that you work when you're looking at how systems work is by talking to survivors. Can you share more about how having conversations with survivors can really help us as a society, as systems, and I'm including community organizations and systems, really better understand what domestic violence looks like and what's needed?
Yeah. I mean, what I often see in terms of what I might sort of call like a stereotypical sort of monitoring and evaluation report, right, is there'll be an evaluation of a system, and that evaluation will say, this is what happened, this is how many cases, this is how many cases this, and this is how many cases, included sexual violence, this is how many cases physical violence, right? And here's what we did for all of those.
Right.
That's fine, right? But our sort of thinking about this is that we would say, anytime you have an institution, right, whether it's DAP or whether it's the police or a prosecution or another community-based organization,
right,
survivors come into that institution and there's always a gap for some survivor. No organization can meet the needs for all survivors.
Right.
And so our response is to say systemically is that we're going to focus on this institution or group of institutions for a period of time. And we don't want to know just what that institution produces, but what about from the standpoint of the survivor, right? What's their lived experience with this? And what we're asking for when we're asking survivors about it is I've often heard the criticism, well, I saw that you only talked with 37 survivors, right? And that's not a big enough random sample. I said, okay, but that's not the analysis. The analysis is I don't have to hear from too many survivors to see, regardless of who they are, the way this institution or system is organizing and coordinating their work, it's going to produce the same problematic outcome.
Right.
Because it's not considering the standpoint from a survivor's perspective and what they need and what the institution is giving.
Yeah. And, folks who might engage in, like as an organization, I'll take DAP as an example, we might do an evaluation to see how we're functioning, but we shouldn't just be like, we did that at this time and assume that things have not shifted.
Right.
Right. Or that with times as gaps get filled, there's other gaps that might pop up that we need to then look at and address. And so really when we're thinking about analyzing ourselves and evaluating, it's something that needs to be like a living experience that organizations continue to engage in and continue to bring in victim survivor voices.
Yeah. So what I would say is that I really encourage every community-based organization, every system, that at a minimum, once a year, you were doing a focus group of survivors, right? So as an organization like DAP, decide what it's going to be. Pick a different topic every year, right? And learn about something from that group of people, whoever they are, or because at DAP, it could be, persons who use violence, right? It could be, children that Kira works with. Do a focus group with them to find out, right? What I want organizations to do and systems to do is once a year. So at least, right? So in a coordinated community response, I was recently in a nearby state working with their coordinated community response. I said, okay, I'm going to check back with you in a year, right? And what the first question is, what do you want to focus on? What do you want to learn more about? Right? And from the perspective of a survivor about how this system is responding or not responding or even making it worse, right? That's the thing to figure out as a multidisciplinary group that we have to continually looking at. And so focusing on that's important as a system and learning from survivors. And I would say lastly, and be open to what they have to say and not defensive. Because I've sat in too many meetings, well, that was just that one. It's like, no. I want to be clear. We didn't ask them about a particular practitioner. We're looking at a systemic response that will continually produce that outcome for survivors over and over and over again, right? It wasn't like they got the bad worker or whatever, right, in that institution. We're only going to include in our report or in our summary items that have nothing to do with the bad worker, but it will produce that outcome regardless.
Right. So what role do you think that structural or institutional systems play in actually creating instability or challenges or gaps for survivors themselves and like perpetuating violence? I also would love to ask the flip, like what role do you think systems and institutions play in disrupting the violence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we can have a gap between how we respond that's aligned with their lived experience or not, for example, right? I think one of the things that we've learned in a number of communities, including Minneapolis, is if you're going to create a systemic response that asks survivors about certain aspects of the abuse, you need to do it in a way that, A, you know this is part of the lived experience, right? And the way the community talks about it, right? So just a quick example would be, I remember one of the questions used to be at one time, has your partner ever coerced you into doing any sexual acts? Have they coerced you to do any of those? And when we asked survivors, like to look at all these questions, what do you think? Survivors said, well, that one I'm going to say no to. And I said, oh, okay. Tell me a little bit more about why. She said, it has nothing to do with if it actually happened, because I have no idea what coerced means. Right. And so I'm just going to say no. Right. Because it's, I don't know what it means. And the survivor said, okay, so what I said, can we talk about that a little bit? She said, yes. She said, so I said, well, coerce means, has your partner ever forced you to do things sexually you didn't want to do? And she said, well, why didn't you just ask me that?
Right.
It's like, well, duh, of course we should. Right. So that's the sort of thing, is that when the language about how we talk about things, the way we see the problem, right, can either reinforce it. So an example would be, to your point of making it worse, Amirthini, would be if we continue to give messages that the violence is only perpetrated because of alcohol or mental health.
Right.
That's a real big problem. And that's the one I see systems doing
all the time.
All the time. So you're giving survivors a message then that if they stop drinking, the violence will end. And if they address their mental health as an abuser, it will end, right? And what I know from the research I read is that, yes, addressing it can help, but it's not going to end it, because in most cases, it's not the cause of the violence, right? And so too often, and then we're giving survivors this hope about that. That's a real problem.
Right.
But like example quickly with alcohol, we know I would say it's adding fuel to the fire, right? You take an abuser who has thinking that says, I get to tell you what to do whenever I want.
Right.
And then when they're drinking, they're going to extra force that thinking, right? And it'll be more severe.
Yep.
We know that will often make it more severe. So absolutely, survivors will have experience where the worst situation is often tied to alcohol.
Right.
But take away that alcohol,
it's still there.
Yeah, does he still think that way?
Right. I think too, when alcohol is involved and focused on, then that can also feel to the victim like part of their responsibility and why they experienced violence at all. Whether or not they're going to be taken seriously, believed, and supported if they're asking for support around ending the violence.
Yeah. One other thing about that I think is interesting is I've talked to a number of substance abuse treatment providers. And I know it's common in the substance abuse world to have what are called family meetings, right? I've been to some of those.
Yep.
And one of the problematic things I see in those meetings is they're not accounting for the power differential that the past violence has created, right? So they're asking survivors and children who've lived under this for years to come. And too often, so they'll acknowledge that domestic violence happened. But there's this sense where it's like, because he's not drinking anymore, it's like, you don't know that. But the other thing is, the way I've seen that play out in a bad way is the messaging often. So like, let's say the person who's used violence is a man, he's going to be coming back home. And the message is now you need to support them, right? In their journey of sobriety.
Right.
The way that plays out is that then the teenage child or the survivor does something that the abuser doesn't like, right? They either use violence or they use substances, and then they blame, see, you were supposed to support me in my sobriety, right? So I don't think that anybody who, and I really mean that, maybe there's like a couple of people out there, but most people wake up in the morning and think, I want to make things better for the lives of all the people I talk to today. So I don't think that any people who are doing that do it with ill intent. I genuinely don't, right? But what I do know is when it comes to this, that power differential doesn't get accounted for enough.
Right, absolutely. And it's another way that we can perpetually re-victimize victims and put them in positions where we're becoming part of the coercion. When you think about prevention and change making, how do you think that we can build prevention strategies that address intimate partner violence, family violence, and community violence simultaneously?
Yeah. So, this is a way to sort of think about this. So even just the way you just said that, I would say, is that, we don't live isolated, lives, right? Yes, I have my own life, right? I have one as a mother. I have one as a wife, right? I have one as a family member. We all, right, have all these different ways. Workplaces, right? So part of it is that we have to think not just about individual responses, right? And I think DAP is a really good example of this, because for me, what I love about DAP is that, yes, you are very intentional about working on the individual trauma that people are experiencing, but you also do it in a way that also accounts for how systems and institutions respond to the violence and how the community does. And too often what I see is that I see people focus people are agencies or interventions. Either that agency focuses too much in their messaging, right? And they'll say like, it's trauma. And if you ended the trauma, you'd end the violence, right? There are lots of people who experience a traumatic event in their life who are not going out and then perpetrating violence, right? I mean, survivors, for example. Or if you take as a group, in this country, in the United States, in terms of the rate, Native American survivors, right? Aboriginal survivors experience it at a higher rate than any other group generally in this country, right? And so what I would say then is, why then are they not out killing the most people, right? If trauma is the cause, right, of that. It's because there are different groups of people, right, particularly when it comes to gender, right, men, for example, right, who are given more social permission to take that internal pain, right, and perpetrate violence against what I would say like groups of people who they see entitled to use it against, right? And we all give social permission in messaging as a broader culture. Right. And then institutions do as well, right? So it's the broader culture gives that message. The institutions and systems don't always do a good job of holding them accountable, right? And then even within their own family, right? They're not getting, those messages. And I would say the way you see that play out, just very quickly in each of those, is victim blaming, right? You look at any major incident of domestic violence, go check the comment feed and tell me how quickly, right? I'm not directing you to do this, but anybody who's listening right now, right? Go look at the comment feed. I encourage you to look at that and see how much of what gets talked about blames any of the victims, or even victims who are just killed, for crying out loud. Right. I see it so often. That's a messaging to survivors, right? Or when somebody isn't held accountable, right? So you find out that somebody who just killed someone wasn't held accountable. That's a message to survivors, right? As well, is that why tell anyone in the system, the police or whoever? Nobody's going to hold them accountable. Well, that's right. The system and the institutions not doing that. Right. So systems and institutions send messages to abusers and to survivors and children, as well as the broader culture, right? And then with our own families. I mean, my experience with too many abusers is that their families do not hold them accountable. I got asked once, if you ever get worried, I'm working with abusers, I said, no, but a couple of their mothers have scared me because their mothers, they came to the office. They screamed at me, sent me nasty emails because I don't know her, and if I knew her, and blah, 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 sort of stuff.
I think one of the most public cases most recently is the P. Diddy case.
Yes.
And, even thinking about the way that the defense shaped their defense was so much about, like, he wasn't engaging in trafficking, he was just engaging in domestic violence. And so the way that they talked about that, the way that they structured their messaging around it, the minimization around domestic violence, and again, to your comment about reading the comments, the way that people really then attack the character of victim survivors when they are able to leave and what the circumstances around that. I think there's so much lack of understanding around coercion and control. And it was such a visualization and confirmation of how, as a society, we really rank violence, gender-based violence. Pretty egregious, but such a national example of what you're talking about.
Well, I also think Amirthini, of course, and also by race also, right, for Black survivors, right? So UGIMA is one of the organizations that works on, domestic violence in the Black community in the U.S. And I try to support them in their work, but most importantly, I'm trying to learn from them and their experience, right, with survivors, right, from the Black community. And they put out some really just helpful statements to sort of, talk about it. And I'm going to make sure to read those, as a white-bodied, woman living, in this country. I have no idea what that's like, right? And, I think one of the, there's that study that came out not too long ago related to, by race related to giving after birth, right, of a child, right? Do you remember the study where it said that more Black women died, right, post giving birth than white women? And they've studied now actually more than once, right? And what they have said is that overwhelmingly that Black women were not believed as, quick or at all when they said, I don't feel right. Right. I'm in pain here. I need your help. Right. Like I'm feeling faint, I'm just sort of generalizing here. Right. So I think that's also a very strong, element too, is that how that, all that, plays out as well.
Yeah, and what that's rooted in and where that mentality came from and how it's tied to we were talking about this in an earlier podcast with the director, Kalina Burks, from the Missing and Murdered Black Women and Girls Task Force.
Exactly.
And the historical roots of having that type of biased perspective, given what people would say, perceive, want to believe about Black bodies when it came to experiencing violence on a communal level versus an intimate partner level. And how that's really carried over, that messaging has really carried over. And even talking about statistics around police-related deaths of Black and brown bodies compared to maternal deaths in hospital settings, and how one gets talked about and the other does not. But I think very much tied to the idea that there are certain voices that are not believed for a variety of reasons, and how when we don't believe, it often leads to harm for that individual. But as a society, we need to make so much changes to get ourselves to a place where we can actually see where our bias is and what that's rooted in. Maybe to wrap up today, what gives you hope in this work, especially when you're addressing violence in multiple forms across multiple systems or levels of intervention? What's giving you hope right now?
Well, what I might describe it sort of this way is to say, in the current, what are we in, 2025? Yeah. In this current year, in current time, in the United States of America, the one thing that gives me hope is that I think resistance is extraordinarily important. And I also know that not all groups of people can safely resist, but I think I see the hope in resistance and a groundswell of organizing sort of overtly and covertly, right, to resist. And I think I see a lot more of that sort of happening, and I think that that's where I see the hope in this, and that we really have to align ourselves also together, right, in a way that maybe we haven't before, as organizations, just as, females, like all this sort of in terms of what things mean, right? And I often think, I think it was Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, in fact, speak up even if your voice shakes. And I just feel like I know I'm in a social position, right, where because of my years of experience, I'm given credibility. Because of my race, I'm given credibility in other ways that other women or not. But I still am socially, I might describe it this way. I suffer from imposter syndrome, or just to say, like, I don't actually often have a lot of confidence, honestly. And so, I don't know why it's even making me just like emotional, because I have to really work through it often to be like I go through this little thing where I'm like, no, I do know some things. And, and I try really hard to not just say, like, I know this for sure, but that I do, if people want to know from me, and I always like, you need to learn that from other people too. And so I'm just trying to have a consciousness about doing it from others. But I think it's also just that sort of thing is being able to, the hope comes from hard times can also bond people together. And because you need to sort of like, maybe be a little bit more vulnerable if you can. And so I would say that's where the hope comes from.
I really appreciate your vulnerability. And I think it's wonderful modeling. And I think even in thinking about systems change, I feel like on a societal level, we struggle with imposter syndrome and feeling like we need to do things a certain way to show that we know the things that we know, that we can make the change that we know we need to make in order to create a better system, better service, better environment for survivors. I feel like what you just shared is so real. And I struggle with it as a leader, as a person. And I think in ways that we've also shared community, I think there's lots of ways that we can see it. I think survivors experience that. I think folks that use violence experience that when it comes to whether or not they can actually change and whether the change is real. So I think it's lovely that you named it for all the reasons.
I remember just telling a survivor when I was doing a focus group one time, maybe I'll end with this. I asked a survivor what they thought about something, and she said, I just said, do you really want to know what I think? And I said, yeah, I do. And she said, I just want you to know that I so rarely have an experience where people actually want to know what I think. Not because I'm so used to other people telling me what to think, right? So I also know while I experience this, survivors have so many more layers of that, right? Because, I've had experiences of sexual violence, but not intimate partner violence. So it's different, right? My experience of intimate partner was as a teenager, but not as an adult and not with children. That's a different experience, right? And so for survivors to break through, it's so many more layers of that. And that's another example, having just to acknowledge.
It reminded me of, going to a therapy session where I was like all ready to, it was a brand new therapist. I was all ready to talk about stuff. And I heard that the therapist would ask you a lot of questions about how you felt in her space. And I was like, I don't want to talk about that. Like, I have my agenda. And I got in there and it was 90 minutes of her asking me to look around and to tell her whether I was comfortable, yes or no. And what I didn't like about something. So like, do I like having that picture frame there within my eye of sight or my line of sight? And I thought about it and I was like, these are weird questions. But then when I thought about it, I was like, I actually have an opinion about that. And I don't want it in my line of sight. And so then she was able to move it away. And eventually, I was very pregnant at the time. I was the most comfortable I had ever been to date by the end of this therapy session, because I had, with this openness from her, created an environment that was of my own choice and volition. And learned that I have an abundance of perspectives, and I know what my gut wants, but I have to be willing to listen to it and then trust that that's real. And I think in domestic violence, with sexual violence, with all types of other things in society, we're taught to question that by other people, that we're told are more powerful or more correct. And it really seeps in lots of different ways. So,
and that's why in part, like when we're designing services, particularly, community-based organizations, survivors are used to living here, right? We have to model and live in partnership, right, with survivors, with each other's co-workers,
right?
Because anything we do to reinforce this is really problematic in our own institutions. We have to be able to do it from this. And you just reminded me about what one survivor organization did one time related to that, Amirthini. They said the thing we want to focus on in the next year is we want groups of survivors to come in and say, what would make this space more comfortable for you? They just asked, every time a survivor came in, they said they learned it was a lot. And a lot of things they didn't think about, and things that really mattered to survivors about coming into this space, sharing the most vulnerable things. And so anyway, it might be of that.
And what I got out of that 90-minute session was 90 minutes of learning and getting comfortable saying yes and saying no out loud, having someone listen and respect it, and really reinforcing that my gut was good. And my laundry list no longer mattered, because at the end of the day, everything I would have talked about was really tied to that. And so I got exactly what I needed. And it was a really simple experience. So with that, thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today.
Of course.
Thank you so much for listening and for being part of our growing community. If you found today's conversation to be meaningful, please share it with a friend, leave a review or subscribe so that you never miss an episode. And remember that real change starts with honest conversations. So until next time, take care of yourself and of each other.